Growing up, it was clear as day that my sister Mary was my parents' favorite. Mary's 33 now, and she's always been the golden child. 2 years older than me, she's exactly the kind of daughter they wanted. Athletic, pretty, smart. Mom even had nicknames for her, calling her Golden Apple or Baby Pie. While I was just the other daughter, I always felt like an afterthought. When I was born, my parents made it pretty clear that I was a surprise, and a costly one at that. I came into the world 2 months early with a heart condition, and I grew up hearing passive-aggressive comments about how much I cost them. I remember my mom would say things like, "Imagine what we could do if we didn't have all these medical bills." But here's the kicker. It wasn't even my parents who covered those bills. My grandparents did. Yet somehow I still grew up feeling like a burden, while Mary was practically worshipped. If she brought home a B, they'd tell her she was brilliant. If she so much as smiled, it was, "Look at our golden child." Everything she did was framed as amazing, like she could do no wrong. And Mary knew it too. She played into the whole dynamic, which made it even worse for me. She was never just their favorite. She was outright mean to me, and my parents never once stepped in to stop her. I'll never forget one time when she pushed me down the stairs for touching her school project. My back was bruised for weeks, and my mom's response? "You should be more careful with Mary's things." It felt like I was invisible, only noticed if I made a mistake or somehow inconvenienced them. You'd think that having a sister close in age would mean we'd be friends. But for Mary, I was just a target or someone to blame when things didn't go her way. School was supposed to be my escape, but it wasn't easy there either. My health issues kept me out of school a lot, and I was always playing catch-up. Mary, of course, excelled, always getting straight A's and joining every sport under the sun. My parents didn't miss a single one of her games or events. For me, they barely showed up. I remember one time I won a writing award and begged them to come to the ceremony, but they said they couldn't miss Mary's soccer game. It wasn't just the big things either. It was every little moment. Every year, Mary would get these elaborate birthday parties with themes, decorations, and friends over. She had the full package. Mine? They'd throw something together last minute or promise we'd celebrate later, which of course never happened. I grew up watching my parents light up around her, smiling and laughing in a way I never saw when it was just the three of us. By high school, I'd learned to keep my head down. Mary was on her way to a top college with friends everywhere, while I just wanted to get by without feeling like a disappointment. But my parents didn't make that easy. "Why can't you be more like Mary?" they'd say. "Look at how hard she works." It didn't matter if I was doing well in my classes or bringing home good grades. They only ever seemed to notice when I slipped up. The final straw was when I graduated high school. By then, I was beyond ready to get out of that house. My grandparents stepped in again, helping me go to college several states away, and I was so grateful. I can't even explain how freeing it felt to finally leave, to be out of Mary's shadow, away from the constant comparisons. For the first time in my life, I was just me. At college, I started to see how much my parents' favoritism had messed with my self-esteem. I'd spent my whole life feeling like I wasn't enough, that I was just a burden. But slowly, I started to shake off that feeling. I wasn't the failure they'd made me feel like. I was just someone who'd been pushed aside for most of her life. Looking back now, it's wild how much of my self-worth was tangled up in their approval. Then, college changed everything for me in ways I never expected. I met Greg. Meeting Greg was like a breath of fresh air. We met during one of those awkward freshman icebreaker events, and somehow he made it feel easy. From the start, he wasn't like anyone I'd ever known. Greg saw me, not Mary's sister or the sick one, just me, and he actually listened. He'd sit with me, patient and kind, as I talked about my family, my childhood, and the feeling of being invisible. He never made me feel like I was burdening him or asking too much. He saw past all of it, and with him, I finally felt like I was worth something. He made me feel beautiful too, which was something I'd never really experienced. Growing up, I'd always been compared to Mary, who was the pretty one. But with Greg, I didn't have to compete with anyone. He loved me for who I was, and slowly, I started to believe in myself too. I began to let go of those years of feeling less than, years of wondering if maybe my parents were right about me. With Greg, I started to believe that I deserved to be loved just as I was. When we graduated, Greg proposed. Of course I said yes. His family was thrilled, all smiles and hugs, offering to help us with the wedding however they could. They made me feel like one of their own, something I'd never felt with my own family. Meanwhile, my family's reaction couldn't have been colder. When I called to tell my mom the news, she sighed and said, "We just spent a fortune on Mary's wedding last year, so don't expect us to contribute." I told myself it was fine, that I didn't need their money, but it still hurt. I wasn't asking for anything extravagant. I just wanted them to show up, to care, to be there for me. But they couldn't even do that. Not only did they not help, but they didn't even come. Not my mom, not my dad, not Mary. They didn't send a card or a congratulations, nothing. It was like I didn't even exist. But I wasn't going to let that ruin my day. Greg's family was amazing. His mom even went with me to pick out my dress, something I never thought I'd have with anyone in my life. She treated me like her own daughter, and for once, I felt like I was part of a family that actually cared. Our wedding wasn't huge or fancy like Mary's, but it was perfect for us. We got married in the city where we'd graduated, and it felt like the fresh start I'd been waiting for my whole life. We decided to settle down there, far from the toxic mess of my family back home. We built a life together, quietly and happily. My only real contact with my family was my grandparents, who were the only ones who ever made me feel like I mattered. I barely spoke to my parents or Mary, and that distance was exactly what I needed. For the first time, I was genuinely happy. And then, a few years later, everything changed again. I found out I was pregnant. It was this strange mix of emotions, excitement, fear, and joy all at once. Because of my heart condition, I'd known pregnancy could be risky, and my doctors had warned me about it. But now, here I was, staring at the test, knowing that Greg and I were about to become parents. When I told Greg, he was over the moon, but I could see the worry in his eyes too. We both knew this wouldn't be an easy journey, and it wasn't. The pregnancy was rough from the start. There were complications, one after another, and at one point, my doctors advised me to terminate, saying the pregnancy could be fatal for me. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I was scared out of my mind, but I wanted this baby more than anything. Greg supported me every step of the way, even though I knew he was terrified too. Those months were some of the hardest of my life, filled with hospital stays and constant monitoring. The strain on my heart was intense, and there were days I didn't know if I'd make it. But somehow, against all odds, we did it. Our son was born healthy, and I made it through, just barely. The doctors were clear my heart couldn't take another pregnancy. They told me without any sugarcoating that I'd be risking my life to try again. Greg and I agreed right then and there that we were happy with our little family and that we wouldn't push our luck. Looking back, I don't know how I managed to make it through without losing my mind. The experience was terrifying, but Greg was my rock. He was there every single day by my side, and that's something I'll never forget. He's been the one constant, the one person who's always had my back, and because of him, I felt like I was finally building a life that didn't revolve around proving myself to people who didn't care. For a while, life was quiet. We were focused on raising our son and just enjoying the little family we'd built. It wasn't easy, but it was ours, and that was more than enough for me. I had finally created something good, something that wasn't tied to the pain and rejection I grew up with. Then came the decision to move back to my hometown. It wasn't by choice, really, but my grandpa's health started to decline, and I couldn't bear the thought of being far away if something happened. My grandparents had always been there for me, and I wanted to be close to them, especially as my grandpa's health got worse. So Greg and I talked it over and decided to make the move. I wasn't thrilled about being back. The thought of running into my parents or Mary made me nervous, especially after all these years. But the need to be there for my grandpa outweighed my fears of old family drama. We found a place on the other side of town, far enough that we wouldn't have to see my family unless we wanted to. I figured I'd just visit my grandparents and keep my distance from my parents. Simple enough, right? Of course, nothing ever goes as planned with family. From the moment we got back, my parents and Mary started acting different. All of a sudden, my mom was calling me, asking how I was doing, and telling me how proud she was of everything I'd accomplished. My dad started sending texts, checking in on how we were settling in. Even Mary, who had treated me like I was invisible growing up, was suddenly nice, chatting with me when we bumped into each other around town. I wasn't buying it. You don't go from being ignored for years to suddenly becoming the favorite child just because you moved back. Something was off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Part of me wanted to believe maybe they had changed, that maybe they'd realized how awful things had been and were trying to make up for it. But deep down, I knew better. Years of that kind of treatment don't just vanish overnight. I talked to my grandma about it, and she encouraged me to keep an open mind, saying maybe they did miss me. So I tried, even though I couldn't shake the feeling that this was all too good to be true. Then 2 weeks after we'd moved back, my parents invited us over for dinner. I was wary, but Greg convinced me to give it a shot, saying maybe they were genuinely trying to reconnect. So against my better judgment, we went. When we got there, everything seemed normal enough. My mom had made her famous lasagna, and we all sat around the table, making small talk. For a moment, I almost believed it was a normal family dinner, like maybe things really had changed. But halfway through the meal, Mary announced that she had a surprise for me. She was sitting across from me with this smug smile, and I felt my stomach drop. Surprises from Mary were never good. She pulled out a fancy-looking envelope from her bag and handed it to me like she was giving me some kind of award. Confused, I opened it, expecting, I don't know, maybe some kind of apology or thank you for moving back to be closer. What I read instead left me speechless. Inside was a letter congratulating me on becoming her future baby's carrier. She'd written it as if I should be honored, as if it were some great privilege to risk my life for her. I couldn't believe it. I looked up, trying to process what I'd just read, but the look on her face told me she was dead serious. I just sat there, staring at the letter, trying to process what was happening. Mary's words, "Congratulations on being my future baby's carrier," swirled around in my head like some twisted joke. But the way she was looking at me, expectant, smug, told me she was completely serious. My parents sat there, calm and composed, like they were in on it, like they actually thought this was a reasonable thing to ask of me. When I finally managed to speak, I told her I couldn't do it, that it wasn't even a choice for me. My pregnancy with my son had nearly killed me. The doctors were very clear that I shouldn't attempt it again. But before I could finish, Mary's eyes welled up, and she burst into tears. Now, normally, I wouldn't care much if she cried, but my parents leapt into action as if I'd slapped her across the face. My dad started yelling at me for being selfish, and my mom chimed in saying, "This is for family. We do things for family. It was like I hadn't even spoken. They brushed aside everything I'd just said about my heart condition, the dangers of pregnancy, all of it. They acted as if I was a terrible person for not wanting to risk my life to carry Mary's child. The whole scene erupted into this awful, one-sided argument with my parents, and Mary ganging up on me, telling me I was a horrible sister, that I was being selfish, and that Mary deserved the chance to have a family. I sat there stunned and numb while they tore into me. Greg, thankfully, had been sitting beside me the whole time. He wasn't one for drama, but even he couldn't sit there and listen to this. He stood up, firmly told them we were leaving, and we walked out of there without looking back. The drive home was silent. We were both trying to wrap our heads around what had just happened. It wasn't just the audacity of what they'd asked. It was the way they'd all reacted when I said no, like I was some ungrateful, selfish stranger for not wanting to sacrifice my life for Mary. I knew she was upset about not being able to have children, but the fact that they'd even thought it was okay to ask me to put my life on the line without so much as a heads up, it was beyond anything I could imagine. I hadn't spoken to any of them since that night. In the quiet that followed, I started to feel a weird mix of guilt and anger. I knew in my heart that I'd done the right thing, but it didn't stop that nagging, twisted guilt from creeping in. Family has a way of getting into your head, making you feel like you're somehow in the wrong for standing up for yourself. But I had to keep reminding myself, my health, my life came first. It was a truth that kept me grounded even as I wrestled with all the old hurt they'd stirred up. Then, after a few weeks of silence, I got a message from my mom. I expected an apology or some attempt to make things right, but instead it was just, "We need to talk." Direct. No hint of regret or understanding, just those 4 words. I showed Greg and he didn't even need to say it. I knew I had to brace myself for more drama. Against my better judgment, I replied, simply asking what she wanted to talk about. She replied quickly, saying she wanted to meet and that it was important. When I asked if Greg could come, she shut it down immediately. "Just you," she insisted. That alone was a huge red flag, but for reasons I couldn't fully explain, I agreed. When I arrived at the coffee shop, she was already there looking relaxed, sipping her drink like it was any other day. She didn't ask how I was or even mention the dinner. She jumped straight into the reason she wanted to meet, Mary. Apparently, Mary was devastated, and it was my job, according to my mom, to reconsider helping her. No apology, no acknowledgement of my health concerns, just a guilt trip about how hard things had been for Mary, how she deserved to have a family, and how I was the only one who could make this right. As she droned on about family loyalty, I just sat there, letting her words wash over me. She pulled the family sticks together card, like that meant anything coming from someone who hadn't cared about me growing up. When she finally paused, I told her, calmly but firmly, that my answer hadn't changed. I explained again that my doctors had warned me that another pregnancy could kill me, and I wasn't willing to take that risk. I thought that maybe, just maybe, she'd understand. Instead, she looked at me like I was some kind of monster. "You're being selfish," she spat. "Mary needs you, and you're just turning your back on her." I couldn't believe it. After everything they'd put me through, after a lifetime of being treated like I was less than, here she was, calling me selfish for finally putting myself first. I told her I wasn't turning my back on anyone. I was protecting myself and my family. But she didn't want to hear it. She just kept pushing, kept trying to guilt trip me as if nothing I said mattered. That's when it hit me. Nothing would ever change. To them, I would always be second to Mary. No matter what I did, they would always see me as the selfish one for not bending to their will. I realized then that they weren't trying to understand me. They were just trying to control me. I stood up, looked her in the eyes, and told her I was done. I wasn't going to be manipulated anymore, and I wasn't going to sacrifice myself for people who only saw me when it was convenient for them. Then, without waiting for her response, I walked out of the coffee shop. I felt a strange relief as I left, like a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had finally been lifted. When I got home, Greg was there, waiting. I told him everything, and he wasn't surprised. Angry, yes, but not surprised. We both knew that this was how it had always been. Mary first, me somewhere in the background. But now, finally, I felt like I was breaking free. I was done being the scapegoat, done with the guilt and manipulation. It felt like I was finally getting my life back. In the days that followed, I thought that might finally be the end of it. I hoped they would just accept my decision and move on. But of course, they didn't. A few days later, my dad started messaging me, parroting the same lines about tearing the family apart and letting Mary down. The irony was almost laughable. Where was this concern for family when I was growing up, when I was ignored, overlooked, and treated like I was just an extra in Mary's story? Now, all of a sudden, I was the villain for not giving them what they wanted. Then came the messages from Mary herself. Her texts were furious, accusing me of being selfish and saying that I owed her. She actually wrote, "I would do it for you in a heartbeat." I couldn't help but laugh at that. Mary wouldn't have lifted a finger for me if it inconvenienced her. I knew that from years of experience. This whole "I'd do anything for you" act was just another attempt to guilt me into saying yes. The messages kept coming, piling on the pressure, and it was exhausting. Greg kept urging me to block their numbers and just cut them off completely, but it was hard. Cutting off family is a big decision, and even though I knew it was probably the best thing for my mental health, a part of me still wanted to keep that connection, to believe that maybe they'd come to their senses. Weeks passed and things went quiet again. I tried to focus on my own little family, on Greg and our son, who were my world. I kept trying to let go of the guilt and resentment, but in the back of my mind, I knew this wasn't over. And then one day, I got a call from my grandmother. And she's always been the one person in my family who actually cared about me. So when I saw her name pop up, I answered immediately. Her voice was tense, almost panicked. "Sweetheart," she said, "I don't know how to tell you this, but your parents are planning something. You need to be prepared. My stomach dropped. Planning something? Like what? "They're talking about going to a lawyer," she explained. "They think they can take legal action to make you help Mary. Something about medical rights, surrogacy. I don't know the details, but they're serious." I sat there, stunned, as my grandmother told me that my parents were actually considering taking me to court, trying to legally force me to carry Mary's child. It sounded absurd, almost laughable, but at the same time it terrified me. How could they even think of something like that? After we hung up, I told Greg everything. He was furious but calm. He suggested we contact a lawyer just to be safe. As insane as it seemed, we needed to be prepared if they actually went through with it. So we met with a lawyer a few days later and explained the whole situation. She was kind and reassuring, telling us there was no way they could force me to be a surrogate, especially with my medical history. But she agreed it was smart to be prepared, just in case. Weeks went by with no new drama, no legal threats, and no texts from my parents or Mary. It was like they'd finally backed off. But by then it didn't matter. The damage was done. They had shown me who they really were, and there was no going back. One day, out of the blue, I got a final message from my mom. It was short, just a single line. "We're disappointed in you. You've let the family down." For the first time, her words didn't sting. I didn't feel the guilt or the pain. I didn't feel anything. I knew without a doubt that I wasn't the one who had let anyone down. They were the ones who had failed me time and time again. I blocked their numbers after that. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. For the sake of my own family, for my son, and for my sanity, I had to let them go. It's been a few months now. Life is quieter, and I'm finally free from their expectations, their manipulation, and their control. I still think about them sometimes, but not with sadness, just relief. I have my own family now, and for once, that's all I need. After that last message from my mom, I thought it was finally over. I'd blocked their numbers, cut off contact, and tried to move on. It wasn't easy at first. Cutting family ties isn't something you can just shrug off. Even after everything they put me through, I'd spent years longing for their approval. But now, I finally understood that their version of family was all about control, not love. Greg and I focused on building our life together, free from the constant weight of their expectations. Our son was growing up fast, and every day with him felt like a fresh start. I wasn't preoccupied with their judgments anymore. I was surrounded by people who actually saw me and loved me for who I was. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe, like I was finally living for myself. But then, a few months later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated, wondering if it was my family trying to reach out in some new way. Against my better judgment, I answered, only to hear Mary's voice on the other end. She launched into her usual guilt-laden speech about how family is everything and how I'd abandoned her when she needed me most. She said she'd tried everything to get through to me and that she was heartbroken and disappointed in the sister I'd become. Hearing her talk like that, I felt nothing. No guilt, no remorse, no urge to explain myself. I'd given my whole life to that family, done everything I could to be the daughter, the sister they expected. But that wasn't enough for them, because I'd always been expected to play a specific role, one that existed solely for their benefit. Mary kept talking, trying to wear me down, but I didn't bite. When she finally paused, I told her, "I've given you everything I could. I'm done being your backup plan." Then I hung up and blocked her new number, feeling a strange peace settle over me. It was like that call had given me the final push I needed to let go. In the weeks that followed, I found myself reflecting on everything I'd been through with my family. The years of favoritism, the constant comparisons, the manipulation. It had taken me so long to see that their version of family loyalty was built on their needs, not mine. Every sacrifice I'd made, every time I'd tried to be good enough, it was always about what I could do for them, not who I was or what I wanted. One night, as I sat with Greg and our son, watching him play with his favorite toys, I felt something shift in me. I didn't want him growing up with the same expectations, the same need for approval that had haunted me. I wanted him to feel loved and valued just as he was, without feeling like he had to earn it. Greg and I promised each other that we would raise our son with the kind of love I never had. A love that was unconditional, a love that didn't come with strings attached. As time passed, I realized that I was happier than I'd ever been. The emptiness I'd carried for years, that nagging feeling of not being enough, was finally gone. I'd created a life that was mine, surrounded by people who genuinely cared, and I knew without a doubt that I didn't need my parents or Mary to feel whole. Months turned into years, and life moved on. My grandparents kept in touch, though they were getting older, and my grandpa passed away not long after. I went to his funeral, not for my parents or Mary, but for him, because he'd been one of the few people who'd shown me genuine love and support. My mom and dad were there, and though they tried to approach me, I kept my distance. That day was for my grandpa, for honoring the person he'd been in my life, and I wasn't about to let anyone ruin that. My grandma and I stayed in contact, and I made an effort to visit her when I could. She understood why I'd distanced myself from my parents and Mary, and she never pressured me to reconcile. In her quiet way, she supported me, reminding me that family isn't about obligation. It's about choosing the people who lift you up, who see your worth without needing you to prove it. The years kept rolling on, and I grew stronger. I still thought about my parents and Mary from time to time, but it wasn't with sadness or anger anymore. I'd come to terms with the fact that they were never going to be the family I needed, and that was okay. I had Greg, our son, my friends, and even Greg's family, who had welcomed me with open arms. I'd built a new family, one rooted in genuine love and respect. One day, years later, I got a message from my mom through my grandma. She'd asked my grandma to pass along a letter she'd written, one final attempt at reconnecting. I took it, partly out of curiosity, but I didn't read it right away. I wasn't sure if I wanted to open that door again, even if just to read her words on paper. When I finally sat down to read it, I braced myself for the worst. I expected guilt-tripping, accusations, and all the usual tactics. And, true to form, it was a mix of all that. She wrote about how much Mary was struggling without a family, about how they missed me and wanted to put the past behind us. But it was clear she hadn't changed. Her words were full of the same manipulation, the same expectation that I'd eventually give in and go back to playing my old role. There was no acknowledgement of the pain they'd caused, no real understanding of why I'd cut them off. I put the letter away, knowing that I'd made the right decision all those years ago. They weren't going to change, and I wasn't going to sacrifice my happiness or my health just to satisfy their version of family. I chose to walk away, to leave behind a life that was never really mine, and I never regretted it. Looking back now, I can see how much I've grown, how much strength I've found within myself. I've built a life that I'm proud of, a life that doesn't revolve around anyone else's expectations. I'm no longer haunted by the need to prove myself or to earn anyone's love. I'm free, truly free, to live on my own terms. Family, I've learned, isn't just about blood. It's about choosing the people who bring out the best in you and who make you feel seen and valued. And now, surrounded by the family I've built, I know that I've found exactly that.